the Crash Hole is back in an all-new game. Well, quasi-new game. They're just full remakes of the original PlayStation Trilogy. A time of which people say that Crash Bandicoot was at his best. Because let's face it, his 6th and 7th generation games weren't really received all that well.
I had little hopes for Crash making a return. While I was never a die-hard fan of his series, I did enjoy playing the games on the PlayStation 1. I only ever owned the third game, played the first one when my cousin brought it over when I was in middle school, and never really touched the second one. I wouldn't own all three until I downloaded them from the PlayStation Network on my PlayStation 3. I consider my review of the original trilogy to be one of my worst reviews due to how I handled it. I thought about going back and revisiting them to do them correctly, but since the remakes were announced, I thought screw it, I'll do these. We all know Crash's history. Naughty Dog wanted to make a mascot platformer in 3D, calling it Sonic's ass game since you'd always be looking at the character's backside. In 2011, Activision CEO Eric Hirschberg, and I don't care if I'm pronouncing that wrong, said he wanted to bring back Crash Bandicoot. And in 2012, Andy Gavin, the co-creator of the series, said he wanted to see a high-definition version of the first 4 games. During the same year, the other co-creator, Jason Rubin, had said that he hoped that Activision would bring back Crash to his glory days since he's loved by so many people. Even some images leaked from Vicarious Visions, which I've always pronounced wrong until today, worked on the Skylanders games and developed the N.Sane Trilogy, but the images were from a cancelled Crash game. Every year there was more about a new Crash game. In 2013 there was rumors that Sony bought the rights from Activision, but that was not true. And in 2014, Andrew House, CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment, said that they were talking about bringing Crash back and that the idea was never off the table. In 2015 there were rumors of a new Crash Bandicoot game in the works, and in 2016, Activision said that Crash would be a character in Skylanders, which I said should happen in one of my Skylanders reviews, and it was announced that a remaster of the first 3 games was coming to the PlayStation 4, and then the title was unveiled to be Crash Bandicoot: The N.Sane Trilogy.
What I like about this story is that it shows that for 6 years, Crash never left their mind and they've been trying to find a way to bring him back. Unlike how other game companies are when it comes to other series like Mega Man, Final Fight, Banjo-Kazooie, Conquer, Streets of Rage, Phantasy Star, Ape Escape, Siphon Filter, Castlevania, Contra, Rocket Knight, Legacy of Kain, Onimusha, Jack, Sly, Klonoa.
The graphics are amazing, very colorful with lots of cartoony motions, and there is so much detail in the environments. Some sound effects are changed, like when grabbing 1-ups or other tokens. It's not that classic crank then ding sound. It's still a crank and ding, but doesn't have that same oomph as the originals. The soundtrack sounds almost exactly the same, but it's of a much higher quality. I still prefer Clancy Brown as Neo Cortex, but Lex Lang actually does a pretty good job here. And I know people have criticized him for not sounding menacing enough, but he does do a good job. As for the gameplay, I'm going to go over each game individually and in order. Overall, each game is a 3D platformer. You run down a track, each level getting progressively more difficult. The first game can be seen as much easier than its original counterpart, as the remakes now have an autosave feature, which can be deactivated if you want. It makes the first game easier in the sense that if you lose all your lives, it's not back to the beginning, or if you shut the system off, as we all know that the save system in the original Crash wasn't very forgiving, as it could only be accessed through bonus rounds, but there was a password system. The autosave system aside, I think this game is just as difficult as the original. It even controls just like the original. While you can use the analog stick, it still feels like you're only moving in 8 directions as if you're using the directional pad. It doesn't feel like it's a full 360-degree movement. And does anyone else feel this way about how Crash controls in the first one? I am not complaining or criticizing, I just want to know if it's in my head or if the others feel the same, because it does feel authentic to the original Crash Bandicoot. While they added in analog stick controls, playing through the first game is ill-advised with them. I died so many times on Ripperoo because of the analog sticks, as I wasn't holding exactly left, right, up, or down, and fell into the water because of the preciseness needed for jumping around the first game requires. The bonus rounds are not mandatory after collecting 3 Tawana, Embryo, or Cortex tokens. There's a portal that you can use to enter them, and even if you fail, you can go back and try it again until you complete it, and you won't lose a life if you do fail. Also, if you die after a checkpoint, all the boxes you smashed remain smashed, so there's no need to go back and smash them all again. In the original game, if you wanted that gem, you needed to start the level all over again. People have said that you can smash all the boxes and die and still get a gem, but to get a color gem you cannot die at all. it must be a perfect run. Now, while the first of the remakes sounds more forgiving, for the most part, it's not by a long shot. Games Radar said that Crash Bandicoot makes The Binding of Isaac looks like a summer getaway, and said that Crash Bandicoot has turned into Dark Souls. While the guy claimed to have played the originals, I don't think he remembers them, or at least has the originals so ingrained into his memory that the different collision detection is screwing with his muscle memory. I remember the first Crash Bandicoot not being forgiving at all. In the native forest level, I went from 22 lives to 8 when I was nearing the end of the level, but jumped back up to 13 since they give you 5 lives right by the goal. And I'll admit, there are some levels in this game that are freaking meat grinders, like Road to Nowhere or Lost City. You need to be so precise with your timing and jumping in those levels, and even in some, like Lost City, there's a section that feels so damn cheap because of a lizard that likes to bounce you off the edge of a platform, knocking you into a pit. And it doesn't seem to matter if you even attacked it. I guess you can jump on it, but because of the pill-shaped collision detection, I've actually slipped off of him and got bumped off. But for the most part, it's a challenging but fair game. However, it's been found out that Crash's jumping is actually sped up, and as I just mentioned, Crash uses a pill-shaped collision detection box, instead of a flat one like the original, which is why Crash slips off the edges of platforms if you're not dead center. The reason for this is because Vicarious Visions did not have access to the source code from the original Crash games, and therefore had to rebuild everything from scratch. So the reason why this game seems so difficult is because all that muscle memory from playing the original over and over is useless for this version. And next we'll move on to Crash 2, Cortex Strikes Back. After playing through the remake of the original and moving on to this, there's a very significant difference in how they play. Crash in Crash 2 feels lighter and not as heavy, and there's more wiggle room when it comes to jumping about platforms. Landing on the edge of a platform doesn't result in instantly falling off as easily as the first. It can still happen, so you don't need to be as precise as you needed to be with the first one, but you can still slip off the edge of a platform due to the collision detection. The analog controls work so much better in this game, and I use them for the most part of it, only occasionally switching to the directional pad in certain areas. In my review of the first trilogy, I made an error saying that the original Crash 2 had no analog support. Truth is, there were 2 versions of Crash 2, an initial release that didn't have analog support and a later one that did. The one on the PlayStation Network, the one that I reviewed, was the initial release lacking the analog support. And like the original Crash 2, nothing has changed except for the graphical update. So Crash now has a slide that can lead to a long jump, and you can crawl and use a belly flop to break reinforced boxes. Getting to the end of the level just isn't enough though. You need to collect a crystal, and if you miss the crystal you need to go back and do it again. Which you shouldn't miss them, unless you choose a path where the crystal isn't, as some levels now have branching pathways, which leads to more exploration instead of just a straight path like the first. There's really nothing much to say about this one, as it's just the second game with a whole new coat of paint. It controls better and it's not as difficult as the first one, but still suffers from that pill-shaped collision detection box, but it's not as bad as the first game. I didn't get a game over until I was on the 16th level, but I did have issues with the slide, like when running from boulders or giant bears. I would slide under a fence and then Crash would stop and start crawling as if the button got stuck, which it wasn't, or maybe it was. My controller is 3 years old and I had to replace the left analog stick recently as the rubber wore off. And finally we move on to Crash Bandicoot 3, or Crash Warp, or as they say in the game, Crash Bandicoot Warped. Crash 3 has always felt like a more refined of the trilogy, and it's still my favorite. For the most part, it's the easiest of the trilogy, especially when you defeat bosses and get power-ups to your abilities, as they can break the game very easily. But it does have its faults. I still hate the racing sections, and they are the worst sections of the game, and you know it's the worst section because you cannot lose any lives at all during this level. Crash into stuff, fall in the pits, you're good, just pick up where you left off. Coco's jet ski stages are also very slippery like an actual jet ski, which makes it hard for some of the very precise turns you need to make. But the platforming sections are very easy. I think I fell into pits maybe 3 times, and the enemies never killed. Although with this game, I did not have an issue with the slide like I did in Crash 2. It could be because Crash 3 was the only one that I owned back in the PlayStation 1 days, and I played it a lot, so I subconsciously know what it's like in the back of my head. I think it's the best one of the trilogy, as it's the most refined and adds a lot of fun gameplay elements like the upgrades upgrades to Crash's abilities, but I don't care for the emphasis on the vehicle section. You have stages where Coco rides a tiger, a jet ski, there's airplane sections, and the motorcycle sections, which I cannot stand due to the need for perfection. I don't get why they changed how the jet ski handles, but not the motorcycle. God forbid you fix the most difficult and unfair portion of the game. And I know there's going to be someone that's going to say, yeah, I found him to be the easiest part of the game. Hey, fuck you! That doesn't help me nor anyone else that had problems with those sections. As I was writing this review, I find myself falling into the same issue that I did with my original Crash Trilogy. Not finding much to talk about, what can I say? With the original series, Naughty Dog pretty much nailed down 3D platforming and got it right. The same with Vicarious Visions. They too got everything about the original Crash series right. The difficulty, level layout, and everything that made the Crash series Crash. Why mess with what's a pretty perfect formula? Because on the whole, it's a very faithful remake. With a few collision detection exceptions, it feels almost exactly like the original PlayStation Trilogy, especially since the developers had to remake the games from scratch because they didn't have access to the source code. These games even suffer from some of the same faults as the original, like the cameras in 1 and 2 causing an odd depth perception, making jumping along the platforms a challenge. There's still gems and special gems that you collect upon smashing every box or through secret routes or death routes. I found myself making use of the manual save system a lot in addition to the autosave. So if I died a lot on a level, I could reload once I figured out the timing, and then go back and complete it without having to worry to regain all those lives I lost. After you beat the first boss in each game, you get to access Coco's time machine, which allows you to play as Coco in most of the levels. It's just cosmetic as Coco plays exactly like Crash. A little disappointing as I was hoping she'd play it a bit differently, but can't have everything. Time attack modes from Crash 3 have been added to Crash 1 and 2, so you can collect silver, gold, and sapphire relics. There's really no reward for them unless you're an achievement whore. Some places, like Polygon, because it's always Polygon, have this trilogy at a lower score than I think it deserves, but I think that their reasoning can be justified, as when it comes to remakes or reboots, they tend to fix all the issues that the originals had, like cameras, control issues making them more refined, adding things that newer entries had. So if you were expecting this trilogy to play differently, like a more advanced or refined version of the originals, then you'll be disappointed. It's very much planted in its PlayStation 1 roots. I'll admit I was expecting the trilogy to play differently as well, but it's not a deal breaker for me that they play like their PS1 counterparts. What I really like though is the reaction that this brought. For years, the big budget AAA industry has been saying that no one buys cartoony platformers anymore, or that platform games don't sell, or some other BS like that. The N.Sane trilogy has seen huge sales numbers, especially in the UK and Europe, and I'm hoping that the success of the N.Sane trilogy will show these publishers that these games are indeed fun, and they do sell, and they are wanted.
If you own a PlayStation 4, this is absolutely a must-have title. It's a great throwback to Crash's old days in the beginning, and hopefully this game sets a precedent for future titles to come.